Thank you so much, Tamar. Thank you, everyone, and good evening, Erev Tov. So this is the third and last meeting of our series here, sessions of introducing Rav Kook in his time and ours. As I think has been obvious until now, but I'll just make it abundantly clear one last time that all we can do in these 3 hours is just barely scratch the surface of this monumental figure, his life, thought, and legacy. So I'm going to try this evening to sort of move along. You can get close to the present. We'll look at some text, but also this will be more visual than the other times with a number of illustrations as well. And Tamar's colleague Gloria is at the ready to help me with the PowerPoint. So when we last met, we took the story through to about 1910 and shortly thereafter 1913, 14. Rav Kook by this point has been the Rav of Yafo and the Moshavot for about a decade. He has established a public presence for himself as somebody who is actively trying to mediate sort of between the old world and the new, Yeshuva Yashan and Yeshuva Chadash, doing so in terms that aren't immediately obvious to the other, trying to explain to the Yeshuva Yashan that these, very heretical chalutzim are actually, noble and idealistic and part of God's plan to make the world a better place, and trying to explain to all these chalutzim types that they ought to understand that their own enterprise only makes sense in terms of some deeper connection to Jewish history, Jewish ethics, Jewish religion, Jewish God, etc., and that they need not be at war with tradition to the extent to which they are, because if the tradition agrees with them more deeply in many ways than they might think. And Rav Kook sees all this in light of his reading of the Kabbalah, as we said, which is very, very powerful. We see how through his reading of the Kabbalah, he sees, as part of the schools of Kabbalistic thought, that see the divine redemption, tikkun, as working through history. Through the Kabbalah, he identifies the land of Israel and the Jewish people with the Torah Shebaal Peh, with sort of seeing that God's presence on earth works through the Jewish people and the Jewish nation, as well as through the oral Torah, as well as through the physical manifestations of the land of Israel, the physical manifestation of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And then at the same time, he's deeply in dialogue with Western philosophy of his time. And indeed, that's less surprising than one might think, not only because all sorts of rabbis were better read than we think, but more deeply because Western philosophy and Kabbalah drew on a number of the same intellectual currents, and they're working on similar theological problems. Now, where we're picking up the story, by the way, and again, Rav Kook by this point he's been developing his own ideas, and he's also, as we talked very, as we've said, crucially, developed this way of expressing himself in spiritual journals that he keeps for himself. It's machberot, sometimes they're called kvatzim, sometimes they're called pinkasim, and he does so both because he writes a lot, and because he's always thinking, trying to figure things out, but also because he believes that self-expression is an integral part of the religious life. God speaks through human consciousness. God speaks to us through our better angels. God speaks to us, all manifestations of idealism, all manifestations of moral and ethical idealism, manifestations of great creativity in art, in literature, are of a piece with God, with religion, all because all these things is this very generous way of looking at things, and what we would call as a theology of culture, in which he sees manifestations of human culture in general and human efforts to improve the world as God working through the world. At the same time, as part of this, he's also developed these ideas of tolerance, not a kind of not a wishy-washy sort of tolerance of, well, nothing's all that true anyway, so who cares? But rather that God is large and capacious. The sages increase peace in the world because one of God's name is peace, and peace means bringing together things that actually disagree with one another. So these are the general attitudes and ideas that he's developed. And he thinks he'd like to share them with rabbinic colleagues, and in rabbinic colleagues outside the land of Israel. And in 1914, he receives an invitation to attend a conference of Agudat Yisrael. Agudat Yisrael, as we know, is a political party political party that's founded in 1912. It's an alliance of sort of German Orthodox intellectuals and activists with Eastern European rabbis and generally Lithuanian, of a more Lithuanian persuasion. Eventually Hasidim come around, but at first Agudat Yisrael is looked down upon by many Hasidic figures because they see even the very act of having a political party and doing newspapers and all that kind of thing is an unwarranted concession to modernity. At any rate, Rav Kook is invited to an Agudat Yisrael conference taking place in Germany in 1914, and he decides to go. He decides to go for personal reasons, and he doesn't want to leave the land of Israel, but he's frankly exhausted, and also his wife, the Rabbinate Rivka, is exhausted and not in good health, and doctors think that it would be a good idea for her to go and get some medical treatment in Europe. And also because he feels that in the last his 10 years in Eretz Yisrael, he's learned so much, and he's experienced so much, and he's thought so much, and he thinks he's developed some perspectives that actually can bridge the divides between religious and non-religious Jews, and he wants to share them with his rabbinic colleagues in Europe. So he goes, and they travel in July 1914. So as you might guess, that is not a very auspicious time to travel to Europe, July 1914, because just a couple of days after they arrive is the outbreak of World War I. And so World War I leaves them stranded in Europe. They are nearly interned because technically they are allies of Russia. They are citizens of Russia. And they are in Germany, and they're nearly sent to an internment camp, and people intervene and manage to keep them out of internment, and they go to neutral Switzerland. They are unable to return to Eretz Yisrael because Eretz Yisrael is under the control of the Turks. The Turks are at war with Russia, and they have no intention of enabling Russian citizens to return to Palestine. Meanwhile, institutions in Palestine, in general, and something we come back to again and again, the Holocaust, World War II and the Holocaust were such utterly mind-boggling, gargantuan horrors that they almost can get us to lose sight of just how badly people suffered during World War I, not only Western culture, but also Jews. Because think about, in America, and generally we're used to thinking of the Western Front and the Battle of the Trenches, but so much of the war was happening in Eastern Europe. And so many Jewish communities were straight in the path of, everybody that Russia was fighting. All the fighting between Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was all happening right where Jewish communities were, and Jews were suffering terribly. And then in Eretz Yisrael, there were terrible sufferings and there were expulsions. The Jews were expelled from Tel Aviv. There was mass starvation. Those of you who've spoken to old Yerushalmim can still hear stories about people who, I remember my uncle telling me about walking into people's homes in Yerushalayim and finding them literally dead of starvation. So it was a terrible, terrible, horrible time. So Rav Kook and his wife find refuge in Switzerland, in a place called St. Gallen, near the Alps. And he thinks, and he writes, and he's trying to make sense of the war. Now, at this point, I'm going to share screen, and can someone, Tamara Buri, can come and tell me, can you see the screen?
Not yet.
Yes, you can? Okay.
No, we cannot.
Not. Okay, so let me close this. Let me share screen. Now can you see them? Yes, now you can see them, right?
Now we can see it, yes.
Okay, great. Excellent. So here are some passages from Rav Kook's notebooks. This one, he is trying to make sense of the war. Now, interestingly, Rav Kook is a messianically minded man to begin with, and all specifically, crucially for Rav Kook, he's able to embrace all these different contradictory. He's able to see the virtue and value in all sorts of different and contradictory ideas, attitudes, politics, parties, cultures, because he sees himself as living in perhaps a messianic era in which all the contradictions and conflicts of human society, and especially among the Jews, are coming to the surface in order to be resolved. And we'll see how he tries to think about this, because World War I, was always when World War I, these great cataclysmic wars, you think, well, maybe some big world historical thing is going to happen now, especially because the day that Russia chose to mobilize was actually Tisha B'Av, which, of course, in Jewish tradition is also the birthday of the Messiah. And yet, it's not obvious how this is supposed to work as a positive development. So Rav Kook writes in his journals, and here I'm going to read, "The world structure currently in the midst of collapse, amid the dreadful storms of the bloody sword, requires the building of the Jewish nation, which is one with the revelation of its spirit, and one with the disintegrating world structure, which is awaiting a force full of unity and a higher spirit," right? The world is tearing itself apart, and it needs something that the Jews can provide. World culture totters, the human spirit is weakened, darkness covers all the people, night covers the earth, and mists the nation, right? And the hour has come. All the world's cultures will be renewed by the renewal of our spirit. Abraham's blessing to all the peoples of the world will begin its work. And on that foundation, there will begin anew our building in Eretz Yisrael. The current destruction will prepare a new rebirth, deep and transforming. So when he's saying this, this is not, right, this is obviously not a sort of a political analysis of what's going on in the war. He's trying, as always, to understand the deeper currents of events. What is the drama of the spirit that is taking place here? Clearly, Western culture is collapsing, and Jews and Judaism, because again, for him, Jewishness properly understood is the union of body and soul. It's realizing divine ideals here on earth, and Jews have what to teach the world. Now, interestingly, Rav Kook also registers the horror of the war, right? Now, when he uses we're going to use the phrase now, we see a passage where he talks about Knesset Yisrael. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. It's worth remembering that, again, for Rav Kook, Knesset Yisrael doesn't just mean the Jewish people. Knesset Yisrael is the Jewish people as that term is understood in the Kabbalah, which is to say the Jewish people as a holy, sacred community. And not only that, it is the inner spiritual core of the Jewish people that is identical to the land of Israel and the Torah Shebaal Peh, the divine presence, the Shekhinah, right? The Jewish people here are God's presence on earth. And how is God's presence on earth reacting to the war? Knesset Yisrael screams in its bonds, "Woe am I, my soul is weary. The secrets of Torah are to aliens. The Torah burns, its parchments burn, and the letters fly. The wise of heart arise at midnight, hands on their loins like women in labor for the sorrow of the world, of Israel, of Shekhinah, of Torah. They weep and wail." You have to understand, often we hear this metaphor of like the Shekhinah is in exile, God's presence is in exile, this idea that comes from the Kabbalah. And, often it's this very touching, tender, poignant, lyrical way of talking about, the human condition and its various disappointments. You see what emerges here is Rav Kook is saying also, like when we talk about the Shekhinah, God's presence being in exile, it's not some gentle, lyrical, poetic metaphor. It's a horrible, horrible, horrible thing, right? It's, as I once heard Rav Shagar, Alav Shalom, speak, you know, the exile of the Shekhinah is often personified as feminine, as sort of like the maternal side of God. Your mother is in exile, right? The source of nurture and compassion and love in the world is homeless, right? That's sort of one way of, it's one of the sort of the clusters of symbols and association here, right? You know, the Shekhinah, God, who God wants to be present with human beings, is suffering, right? And the wise at heart know the depth of the sorrow and its fountain origin, that all the sorrows and darkness, all the rivers and streams of spilled blood are nothing but a faint result of the echo of the higher sorrow of the heaven of Shekhinah, of the separation of essential idealism from its fount of delight, right? Because again, for Rav Kook, idealism is the human aspiration to make a good world, and idealism is also a word for the sphirot, for the dimensions. Human idealism is one manifestation of the divine energies that are at work in the world, and they're all separated, and they call for teshuvah, and we are to God, and our eyes are to God. So you see his use here of teshuvah, and this is appropriate because we're in the month of Elul. There's much to say about this, and actually starting in a few days through E-Team Torah in Motion, I'm going to be giving a 3-part series on Rav Kook's teachings on teshuvah. Teshuvah here obviously means repentance in a personal sort of way, you know, the way of reckoning with one's own sins, the way we always understand it. But it's embedded in a larger understanding of a reconciliation of God and the world. And when God and the world is not reconciled, what do you get? You get the horrible rivers of blood of World War I. That's what he's trying to say here. Now, in the course of the war, his wife and he leave Switzerland. He's invited to London. Brura, if you wouldn't mind calling up the PowerPoint. And, and image number 2. Rav Kook moves to London. He moves to London. He's asked to become the head of the rabbi of a congregation, a community called Mirsky Hadat, which is the Eastern European Orthodox community of Great Britain, of London. And if you wouldn't mind going down to the next slide, please. And this is the home in which he and his wife live, and it's in London's East End. As some of you will obviously recognize, the East End is not the ritzy part of town, right? The East End, especially in those years, is, and even now, it's neighborhoods very much filled with immigrants, just not as many Jewish immigrants. But at the time, it's something like New York's Lower East Side. It's home of poor, working class, Eastern European Jewish immigrants, also lots of Jewish intellectuals and radicals. So the same way he has contact with radicals and revolutionaries in Palestine, he has contact with Jewish radicals and revolutionaries in London. He serves as the rabbi of this community, and he goes on writing and thinking. If we could please go back up to slide number 2, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. And this is a famous photo of his, taken that time in London, and it sort of beautifully shows this sort of wonderfully contemplative nature. And so in London, on the one hand, he goes back to being a regular community rabbi, answering halachic questions, helping with the poor. Indeed, throughout his life, he never cared much about money. So one of the anecdotes from the time in London is that he had this practice when it was usually housewives bringing to him chickens to check to see if they were kosher. If he decided that the chicken wasn't kosher, if it wasn't improperly slaughtered or something, so he felt bad saying that it was kosher and they had to throw it out. So he would take money out from his own pocket and give it to the family so that they could buy a new chicken. Of course, as a result, he and his family were running out of money all the time. And so Mirsky Hadat established the Rabbi's Treif Fund. They put together a special collection so that, if the rabbi said your chicken was treif, he wrote out a little slip and you brought it to the gabbai, and the gabbai gave you money for a chicken. So he does those sorts of things while he's involved in his theologizing and in his thinking. Now, there's different responses to how he looks at the war, because if at this point, if I'm going to start, if you wouldn't mind ending sharing screen, Berea, because I'd like to bring up one more text. Thank you. So now here. So on the one hand, he thinks a great deal about these nations tearing themselves apart. Interestingly, in these years, he doesn't write much about the evils of nationalism. During World War I, he polemicizes very vigorously against Christianity. Rav Kook, he didn't write a whole, in his earlier in his life, especially in his Eastern European years, he had a view sort of like Maimonides' view, that, a Maimonidean type view, that Christianity is one of the monotheistic religions that helps spread God's word in the world. Jesus himself was perhaps misunderstood, that he himself didn't necessarily mean to abrogate the law, et cetera, or even if he did, it's just sort of, in some ways he sees Jesus as sort of like almost like a precursor to some of these second Aliyah types. He's this revolutionary character whose sheer fervor gets the better of him, etc. When World War I comes around, however, Rav Kook blames it on Christianity, as he understands Christianity, and he writes more and more vigorously about Christianity than ever before. Rav Kook, unlike many Kabbalists, you never find in him the demonization of Gentiles. Right? Even though demonization of Gentiles and often demonization of women is a standard feature of Kabbalistic writing, you don't find that with him. What you do find is this vigorous polemic against Christianity on the theological level. To him, the theological crisis of World War I derives from Christianity. Wow. Why? Because to him, he focuses on two Christian doctrines. One, render unto Caesar. Right? Sort of the idea that's stated in the Gospels, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. That sort of politics is the work of politicians, and the word of God has to be kept separate. It's especially true in Catholic thought, right? And that's sort of the basic principle of Saint Augustine's the City of God, that human society is composed of, so to speak, two parallel structures: the City of God and the City of Man. And the City of Man is sort of like an endless replay of Game of Thrones, of just these sort of bloodthirsty oligarchs murdering one another. And the City of God is where spirituality happens, right? And for Rav Kook, that's an abdication of responsibility for this world. And his other argument with Christianity is sort of also the more obvious and straightforward one, sort of antinomianism, right? That Christianity argues, especially Pauline Christianity argues, that the law is not the vessel through which one achieves salvation. And as a result, he sees in this relinquishing of the law, the relinquishing or the abandonment of turning one's back on the ability to actually use the concrete structures of the law to make the world a better place. And at the same time in World War I, he writes very expansively in very universalistic terms, because he sees that there's a great world crisis here, and that maybe there's ways in which people of goodwill can discover one another. And sort of the kind of Jewish identity that he's anticipating is one that will be of a more universalistic bent. And he says in a very famous passage, he talks about a fourfold song that one finds in one's soul. There is one who sings the song of his soul, and in his own soul finds all. And there is one who sings the song of the nation, who cleaves with gentle love to Knesset Yisrael as a whole, and sings her song with her, grieves for her sorrows, and delights in her hopes. And there is one whose soul expands farther beyond the bound of Israel to sing the song of man, of humanity. And there is one whose spirit expands and ascends even higher to the point of unity with all creation, with all creatures and all worlds, and sings with them all. And there is one who ascends above all these songs in a single union, and all sound their voices, the song of the self, of the nation, of man, of the world, all come together within him at every time and every hour. And this perfection in all its fullness ascends and becomes a sacred song, God's song, Israel's song, Yisrael, Shir El, right? Shir El, God's song, a song of God, a simple song, doubled, tripled, quadrupled, the song of songs of Solomon, of Shlomo. And then he quotes the rabbis, Melech Shalom Shalo, the king to whom peace belongs. So again, you hear this idea that God is peace. We've seen earlier, God is peace means God is able to reconcile different and contradictory opinions. But here, God is the place for reconciliation of all these different, so to speak, it's all these perspectives that are like concentric circles of being. Me as a person, me as a member of a nation, and of course, Knesset Yisrael is sort of the ultimate nation in his view, because this is the nation that sort of sees itself as whole, that ideally is wholly, is a collective entirely dedicated to making the world a better place, right? And so from there, from one's identity as a Jew, one's identity as a Jew naturally then takes you to a love for humanity, and then that takes you to a love for like existence and being beyond humanity, animals and all worlds, and the very fact of being, and all sound their voices. Here too, he's working with the Kabbalah, because in the Kabbalah, fourfold song is also a term for the Kabbalistic, for the Sphira Tiferet, which is to say the dimension of divinity that is Torah, not Torah Sheba'al Peh, not the oral Torah, but Torah Shebichtav, the written Torah, the Torah coming directly from God, the Torah as it exists in heaven, uninterpreted, and not as mediated through human beings. So as mediated through human beings, you go through Knesset Yisrael and the Torah Sheba'al Peh, but the higher one goes, so to speak, from God, from a godlike perspective, and the more one ascends, the more universal your view of the world and of the human condition and of the universal condition and of being become. At the same time, and Buri, if we could please go back to the PowerPoint. Thank you. Okay. Do you need me to? Yeah. Okay. Great. So now, if we could go, please, to slide number 4. But again, Rav Kook, it's not like that he's decided, oh, okay, so now World War I is fine because everybody's going to peace and harmony. He's still trying to figure this out. I mean, he's very much torn apart by this. In 1917, he writes this book, a very obscure treatise called Rosh Milin, sort of like the fount of words, the beginning of words, and it's a meditation on the Hebrew alphabet. It's a meditation on like the sort of the meaning to be gleaned from the shapes of letters, right? You take a look at his, Rishmei Machshavot, sort of like jottings down of thoughts, the midrash, to sort of to the exposition, or sort of doing a midrash on Haotiot HaTagin, on the letters, on the crowns, Hanikudot. No, please go back. Right, Haotiot HaNikudot VaTa'amim, on the vowels and on the cantillation points of Avram Yitzchak Kook, who is Eved Lam Kadosh Ladmat HaKodesh, a servant to the whole sacred people in the sacred land, Bir HaKodesh Yafo, in the holy city of Jaffa, Amashavot, etc. Midgorer Ka'ed Bagola, currently living in exile, Toch Emunei Am Segula, among the faithful of the cherished people, Kilat Kodesh Machziki Adat Yishmei Sorim Gola. Okay. And in this book, it's a very difficult book to read, because these very obscure, abstruse meditations on the meaning on the meaning of the very shape of the Hebrew alphabet. And and he explains in the introduction and the afterword why he's writing this, because he says, when you're living in a time when nothing makes sense, when the world is entirely falling apart at the seams, everything is collapsing all around you, you have to go back to the fundamental roots of things. And what is the most fundamental thing? Well, it's language, right? Because language and letters are sort of like the first, there's the great opaque dark silence. And then how does God break the silence in the book of Genesis? God speaks. And that comes light, and that comes creation, right? Language in general, and the Hebrew language in particular, is the foundation of anything we can know. Oh, the letters, the very letters themselves, are the meeting points of nothingness and being. And so he's trying to penetrate to the meaning of these times. Interestingly, his near classmate at Bologna, Bialik, at this same time, is writing his essays on concealment and revealment in language, sort of very mystically inflected languages. He's writing reflections similar. Rav Kook is talking about and writing World War I. Rav Kook writes a lot in his notebooks about the union of halacha and agadah, how law as structure and law as anti-structure, how the analytic parts of our brain and the synthetic parts of our brain, how law and poetry all have to come together, and Bialik is writing similar things at the same time. And then, if you wouldn't mind, Aguria, the next slide. Late 1917, the Balfour Declaration. Now remember, Rav Kook is somebody who already was starting, for some years now, had been starting to see his times as a messianic period, right? He sees Theodore Herzl, as we talked about last week, as Mashiach ben Yosef, first of all, like the precursor to the Messiah, son of David. And now, this great imperial power says that it views with favor the creation of a national Jewish home in Palestine. And it hits him like a thunderbolt. Now, Rav Kook himself is not involved in the run-up to the Balfour Declaration all that much. He was not a player in Anglo-Jewish politics in that sort of way. Chaim Weizmann at some point sort of tries to get him involved and has Nachum Sokolov talk to him, and it's just this is not his thing. Rav Kook throughout his life is not he's politics and diplomacy in any sort of obvious way just really don't interest him. He does write a public letter in support of the Balfour Declaration in Yiddish and gets read out in a bunch of synagogues, but that's about it. But this truly electrifies him. This truly electrifies him because it's really happening, right? He had thought that perhaps the terrible slaughter of the war might be redeemed in some sort of like messianic way, and boom, now here it is. And he starts thinking and thinking and thinking about what to do. And he has to start thinking about politics. Now at this point, I'd like to go back to doing share screen here on one more text. Are Jews going to have to assume political power? There were many, of course, the Balfour Declaration was a great victory for Herzlian Zionism, political Zionism, right? But there were Zionists who were not thrilled with the Balfour Declaration, including, not least among them, somebody we talked about last week, Aaron David Gordon, who was sort of like the secular equivalent of Rav Kook, even though Rav Kook and Gordon, each of them dissolved the usual categories of religious and secular. For Gordon, the Balfour Declaration, Gordon was sort of like the leading thinker of sort of like the evolving kibbutz movement of the people who were actually the Zionists who were working the land as a form of spiritual and moral rejuvenation. For people like Gordon, the Balfour Declaration was a catastrophe. Because that's not how the Jews were supposed to get the land of Israel. The land of Israel was supposed to be an achievement that the Jews achieve through their own growth and their own change and their own self-actualization, not something handed to them at the point of some imperialist powers bayonet. And so for them, it was a crisis. Rav Kook doesn't see it as a crisis. He sees this as an unalloyed good thing, but he is wondering about what happens now. Do Jews have to use force, right? Earlier in the war, he corresponds with a rabbinic colleague, and he starts thinking about, historically, and he rethinks there's the historic rabbinic reticence against Jews self-sacrificing themselves, putting themselves in harm's way. But he thinks that maybe on behalf of the Jewish people as a whole, one might put oneself in harm's way. And indeed, in that correspondence, he suggests that, when there is no king, as there was in the time of the Bible, maybe the Jewish people as a whole has the status of a king. Sort of perhaps the sovereignty that in biblical times reposes in the king may now repose in the people. Right? Which means that the people have authority and have even sort of like biblically sanctioned authority without the existence of a formal monarchy. And he also wonders about the moral compromises involved in politics. And here he talks about we left world politics, right? Meaning we, for the last 2,000 years, Jews haven't participated in politics of the grand kind, politics, diplomacy, war, statecraft as a collective. We left world politics under a duress, right? Jews were forced to. They were kicked out of the land of Israel. They were kicked into exile. But there was an inner will to this, right? Remember, he said that like there was Jewish history proceeds in dialectical fashion, and stage one is the Judaism of the Bible, embodied and vigorous and martial and warlike and all of that stuff. And then the Judaism of exile, which is hyper ethical, hyper spiritual, and that's a good thing. And that this also manifests itself in the Jewish estual of politics for all those years. But that duress had an inner will until that fortunate time when it will be possible to run a polity without evil or barbarity, the time for which we hope. And now the time has come very near. We received in biblical times but the necessary foundation for a people, and once the sprout was weaned, we were deposed from sovereignty, diffused among the Gentiles, sown deep in the earth, until Eight Hazamir. Eight Hazamir, the line from the Song of Songs. And as he says in a number of places, Eight Hazamir is the time of the nightingale, sort of like the time of the nightingale, the birds are chirping in the springtime. But he also says Eight Zamir Aritzim, the time of the pruning of tyrants, like the Russian Revolution. And the voice of the dove will be heard in our land. So you see that he is acknowledging that Jews are going to be returning to politics and that may start to involve the use of force. He himself is confident that Jewish use of force will be different, right? That Jews won't become military and war. Now, the war ends, and he's still in London. And he waits. He doesn't rush back to Eretz Yisrael right at the beginning because he kind of wants to see what's happening. Also, he tries to create a movement called Degel Yerushalayim, which will be sort of in tandem with the Zionist movement, that will sort of like provide all this. Remember, because like his criticism of the religious Zionist party, the Mizrahi, was that the Mizrahi was sort of just willing to be like a faction of the Zionist movement. And he said, no, it shouldn't surrender its independence. So he has these ideas to create something called Degel Yerushalayim, and not much comes of it because he's not really good at organization. The Mizrahi is already part of the Zionist movement, but a number of the ideas that he develops there do play themselves out in the coming years. So, Bert, if you wouldn't mind going back to the Matzeget, please. And if we go to slide number 6. Welcome to Jerusalem. Right? Baruch haba b'shem Hashem, Rabbi Avram Yitzchak HaKohen. Right? He returns. He's invited to become the chief rabbi, chief Ashkenazi rabbi, the chief rabbi essentially, because he's not of Jerusalem, of the community of Jerusalem, and he returns to take up this post as the rabbi of Jerusalem. Now, remember earlier in his time in Eretz Yisrael, in his years in Yaffo, the rabbis of Jerusalem were becoming antagonists of his because they saw him, understandably, as somebody who was advocating for change in all kinds of ways, in ways which that they were extremely uncomfortable, to put it mildly. And now he's in Jerusalem with them. And then, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. In 1920, he publishes a book, Orot. It's edited by his son, Yehuda, and it is a selection from his journals. A number of the things that he writes about the war. That's why those of you who are familiar with the book, to this day, when it's republished, when it's been reprinted many, many times, the opening passages are always called the war, right? Hamilchama. When Orot is published in 1920, clearly he's referring to World War I, right? So that's sort of lost on contemporary readers. But what happens is the readers in Jerusalem now get, even though it's like very carefully edited by his son Tzvi Yehuda, about whose editorial work we'll have more to say in a few minutes, you get the full gust of his journals. And people see who they're dealing with. For instance, one passage that becomes very, very controversial, remember, Rav Kook affirms the body. And he says that like the gymnastics and calisthenics that young Jews do in Zion to build up their bodies are of great spiritual worth and are like a contemporary version of the Psalms sung by King David. So people go crazy with this. The book is, he's excommunicated. The book is burned in a number of circles. People start, issuing bans on him. At some point, people tell him that, some of his chief rabbinic opponents have said that if he's willing to publish some sort of retraction, they'll publish a retraction. So he does issue some sort of retraction. They never publish their retraction, but the die is cast. Now, meanwhile, there's other people with whom he used to lock horns, with whom he sort of reconciles. If we could please go forward to the next slide, Maria. Okay. You remember we talked about his polemics with Eliezer ben Yehuda, right, in 1905. Here we are 15 years later. The gentleman in white is Herbert Samuel, the first High Commissioner of Palestine, and Herbert Samuel was Jewish, and the fact that there was a Jewish High Commissioner blew people's minds and was extremely meaningful to them and gave rise to all sorts of messianic ideas. And here's a reception honoring him. And on the stairs, standing there, is Eliezer ben Yehuda, and coming right out of him is right after him is Rav Kook. And indeed, at this time, Eliezer ben Yehuda is also, in addition to his work as reviving the Hebrew language, the spoken language, as many of you know, Eliezer ben Yehuda also is the author of this truly monumental historical dictionary of the Hebrew language. Just an amazing, as one of my professors in grad school said, it's really one of the wonders of the world, Ben Yehuda's dictionary. And while he's working on it, he starts to send Rav Kook queries, etymological queries. Does he know the source of this or the source of that? As a kind of olive branch, and because he recognizes how erudite Rav Kook is, and that he's sort of burying the hatchet. Rav Kook is now in a much more dynamic environment. If we could move to the next slide, please. Here, at the same place where he's with Eliezer ben Yehuda, they're all standing in the courtyard, and you hear he's talking to Coptic and Syrian priests. And what's interesting is he's really talking to them. If you look closely, and these are stills from a wonderful documentary film called Dreamers and Builders that a number of years ago was put out by my home university's, Brandeis University's National Center for Jewish Film. He's really concentrating as he's talking. So instead that he writes in the journals, he's actually engaged in serious conversation with these Coptic and Syrian priests. Now, another photo from a different setting, if we could please proceed, gives a sense of the complexity of the environment in which he's navigating. This is a reception in 1921 for the British Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill. If you see, there's the woman standing in the doorway. If I move my cursor, do people see it, Bruria, or no? I guess not. So the woman standing in the doorway is Clementine Churchill. Winston Churchill is to her left. The gentleman with the turban is the then Chacham Bashi. I forget his name. He was not a terribly well-known figure. The gentleman with the white sash descending the stairs is Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, who is the leader of the founder of the Edah Haredit, right? Sort of like the avowedly traditionalist Yishuv HaYashan community. And he was Rav Kook's sort of real opposite number, and they regularly locked horns on any manner of things. And here's Rav Kook. And if you take a look in sort of to Mrs. Churchill's right on the stairs, there's a gentleman in a light-colored kafia, and that is the Emir Abdullah of Transjordan, the great-grandfather of the King of Jordan today. So you see this setting. This is a very complicated setting. There's the Haredi world, the Sephardic world, there's the Arab world, there's the British, and this is all in the setting of some new form of Jewish self-government. And a number of these players, not the Arabs as such, but others are going to be present at the creation of that year, 1921, the Chief Rabbinate. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Okay, that's sort of an official portrait of Rav Kook as Chief Rabbi. The Chief Rabbinate is founded in 1921. There are three partners to the creation of the Chief Rabbinate. One, speaking of Winston Churchill, is the British. It's good colonial practice wherever you go to figure out who the local notables are, especially the religious notables, put them in charge of things that don't matter all that much, like religion, like charities, like domestic relations, marriage, and divorce. And that way, you don't have to worry about that, and the locals get to feel like they're governing themselves. And indeed, also remember the Ottomans had left behind the system. That was the system under the Ottomans, the Milliyet system, where Jews and Christians of different sorts, Armenians, and until World War I, but different Christian groups and Jews all were able to govern themselves, had religious jurisdiction. And so as far as the Brits are concerned, that's a great system, and that's what they want to do here. The Zionists want a chief rabbinate because they realize that they need some sort of religious body that can like appropriately represent them to the authorities, appropriately represent them in public opinion, and that they can control. And then there's Rav Kook, who's the obvious candidate for the post of Ashkenazi chief rabbi, and he has his own view of things, of what this is, right? For him, he's been thinking for years about how Jewish law needs to be reformed, how the Jewish future needs to be re-envisioned, how creating a new kind of rabbinate here in the land of Israel is going to be a step towards great transformations in Jewish law and life. So you have these three sets of players who all have very different self-understandings of what they are trying to do. Meanwhile, one has to say Rav Kook has already gotten himself in trouble with the religious Zionists because in 1920, before he's chief rabbi, there are elections held for the self-governing bodies of the Jewish Yishuv, and the question is, will women vote? And the Mizrahi turned to Rav Kook and asked him for halachic opinion, secure in the assumption that he's going to tell them, yes, it's perfectly okay for women to vote because after all, he's so modernizing on so many things. And actually, he says no, women shouldn't vote. And of course, the Mizrahi are very, very angry with him. The Zionists in general, the left and right, Jabotinsky denounces him as some sort of idiot. The workers' papers denounce him as some sort of idiot. The ultra-Orthodox, with whom he's technically agreeing, really aren't all that impressed. They go on denouncing him anyway. Interestingly, his views, like I said, in Rav Kook, you don't find demonization of Gentiles in his writings. You don't find misogynistic comments. You find highly essentialized comments about women, right? Sort of like men are, reason and higher order thinking of like philosophy and that sort of thing, and women are emotion and intuition. That is in some ways condescending, and at the same time, you realize that in his thought world, emotion and intuition regularly rank higher than the intellect and the mind, and themselves are the gateways to prophecy. Which is to say, Rav Kook was not remotely anything like what today we would think of as a feminist. His thought does provide resources for feminist thinking. But anyway, meanwhile, he's trying to establish his chief rabbinate, and also, if you look at the next picture, which exemplifies the roles of the Brits here, you see he's received the Order of the British Empire, and if you take a look closely, you see it's in the shape of a cross. Now, if you take a look at the memoirs of Sir Ronald Storrs, who was the British military governor of Jerusalem in those years, he talks about Rav Kook, and he talks about Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, and he talks about how how the Haredim, Yosef Rav Sonnenfeld, and the rest were just a pleasure to deal with because they were the ideal colonial subjects. They had no political aspirations whatsoever, and they were great. The Sephardim were easy to deal with because they had known what it was like to deal with power under the Ottomans, and so they were appropriately deferential. Rav Kook, he said, was very, very intelligent, but seemed to think that he was the British. He seemed to think that he was Ronald Storrs' equal, and that actually that the Jews were somehow doing a favor by letting the British participate in their national revival. And Storrs did not take that well. He also writes that he was offended by the fact that he was given the Order of the British Empire, and yet would cover it with his lapel. Rav Kook, as you see in this picture, Rav Kook is covering it with his lapel because he's trying to meet the British halfway. He can't go around wearing a cross. I mean, he's like, you think about who he is for a second. He's going to wear a cross around his neck. And so it's just like this photo, it's just like this fascinating picture of different, sort of this meaning of the colonial and the chief rabbi. Now, Rav Kook then is involved in all sorts of activities. He's trying to build religious institutions. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is Rav Kook at the groundbreaking of King George Street. The next time you walk down King George Street, there at the corner of King George and Yafo, you see there's that plaque inaugurating the founding of King George Street, and here he was, right? And standing to his left is the Sephardi chief rabbi, Rav Yaakov Meir. Standing to his right is Menachem Musishkin, who was his chief interlocutor in the Zionist leadership. This is just like one example of he's involved in all sorts of institution building activities and all kinds of other things. If we could go to the next slide. 1924, Rav Kook visits the United States. This is a colorized version of a photo that's taken in 1924 on his way to visit Calvin Coolidge in the White House. He goes to America. He's not terribly interested in America. He's never terribly interested in in America. He goes there to raise money not for his own institutions. He was terrible at raising money for his own institutions, but remember I said something about all these Jewish communities that were devastated by World War I. So he's part of a rabbinic delegation that's trying to raise funds for Jewish communities that are trying to rebuild after World War I. And he's in America for a number of months, and the fundraising doesn't go all that well. He's, according to press reports and other eyewitness accounts, he was like genuinely pained by people heaping honors on him and offering him testimonials and that sort of thing. America didn't leave much of an impression on him, but among the people who did leave a real impression on him were Harry Fischel, the American Jewish philanthropist who eventually buys the home in which Rav Kook lives, in which he starts yeshiva. Bernard Revel, the founder of Yeshiva College, which eventually becomes Yeshiva University. Rav Kook is extremely taken with him and his ideas, and they correspond, and they have all sorts of ideas about doing joint projects together, and that's undone by the economic calamities of the Great Depression. And Louis Brandeis. He meets Louis Brandeis, and several years later tells they speak in German, in sort of Yiddishy German, Germany Yiddish, and several years later he tells he has a conversation with the then Lubavitcher Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Yitzchak Yosef Schneerson, who's looking for people in America who might help alleviate the persecution, of helping in fighting Soviet persecution. And Rav Kook tells him, go to Louis Brandeis. He's a man who can't bear injustice being done to anyone. He said to him in Yiddish, Brent mit tzedek, he's burning up with justice. 1925, we could please go on to the next slide. I'm picking up the pace a little bit because we don't have much time, but I do want to cover a number of things. 1925, Rav Kook speaks at the opening of the Hebrew University. Lord Balfour himself comes, Winston Churchill returns to Palestine, Chaim Weizmann is there. Rav Kook, his opening at the Hebrew University, he speaks at the opening of the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus. And on the one hand, it's like a gesture. On the other hand, it's like a great disaster, his speech there. And there's the fact that he goes on for a very long time in the hot sun. He's very open about his ambivalences about an entirely secular university. And he sort of talks about how, he's very concerned that, the sort of like, on the one hand, sort of he quotes from the verse in Yeshayahu, your heart will sort of like cringe and swell, and sort of like that Israel's contact with the nations is a matter of like swelling and expansiveness and cringing in recoil, and that this is like a necessary dialectical motion as Jewish culture interacts with general culture, but hopefully the university will understand that its true path in life is to enhance Jewish culture. Now, this is in addition, so everybody was upset with him. The Haredim were upset with him, the university was upset with him, everybody was upset with him. Now, what's striking here is that in his journals at the time and in correspondences with people, he's writing far more radical ideas. He's talking about there's this divine spirit that infuses all of human culture, and that religion is just one feature of human culture in general, right? And it's something that happens a lot in these years. His writings in public and his pronouncements in public are often very stilted and sort of very hemmed in by his official capacities, and his more radical ideas he's expressing in the journals, but they don't see the light of day. But one thing he does do, if we could move to the next slide, please, is he creates a yeshiva. A yeshiva hamerkazit haolamit. This is sort of like students in the early years of the yeshiva. The Central World Universal Yeshiva. Now, in his opening address to the people with whom he's going to create this yeshiva. And by the way, the yeshiva is something that he plotted, that laid out when he was writing about Degel Yerushalayim, and that's in his ideas around the time of Balfour Declaration, trying to create this movement. He said, well, there will obviously be a big university in Jerusalem. We'll have to have a big yeshiva in Jerusalem. And here too, he has these ideas of creating a different kind of rabbi. In teaching, there will be his son, his disciple Yaakov Moshe Charlap, and if you'll see, if you're looking at Rav Kook to his left, there's a gentleman called the Nazir. We'll talk more about him later. He's an intellectual in Europe, whom Rav Kook, who became a disciple of Rav Kook during the war, and Rav Kook brings him to Jerusalem to help him develop the curriculum for the yeshiva. So he starts these ideas that he's had about creating a new kind of Talmid Chacham, a new kind of rabbi who's traditional, who's open to the world, who's pious, and undeniably Zionist. So he's involved in all these different sorts of activities. If we could move to the next. In 1929, we have the riots. The riots of 1929, in the summer of 1929, when the Arabs of many of the Arabs in Palestine kill many Jews, and Jews fight in self-defense, and it's a great bloodbath. Rav Kook inadvertently is involved in the events that lead up to it. For the British, in addition to creating a chief rabbinate, they also created a Supreme Muslim Council. The head of the Supreme Muslim Council, as you know, was a man known as the Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj bin al-Husseini. He was not a terribly distinguished cleric. He was a young man in his 20s, but also he was a scion of the al-Husseini family, which was one of the major Arab clans in Jerusalem. And because a Nashashibi had been made mayor by the British, so they felt in order to rival clan, so in order to placate the al-Husseinis, they put in their guy as the Mufti. The Mufti is very committed to the struggle against Palestine, against Zionism, and he tries to make it a pan-Arab struggle and an Islamic struggle, and he focuses on Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. Also, he focuses on the Jerusalem and Temple Mount because there aren't other. The historian Hillel Cohen has written an extremely important book about the 1929 riots that I highly recommend. Also points out the Jews are building, the Zionists are building all kinds of institutions. They're building Tel Aviv, they're building Hebrew University, they're building West Jerusalem, they're building kibbutzim, and so they have their institution building energies are going elsewhere. Palestinian nationalism is kind of not doing that as much, and so it focuses. The Mufti focuses all the more on Jerusalem and on the Temple Mount. Now, at the Temple Mount, historically, Jews were not allowed to have permanent structures. So, remember what today we know as the Kotel is just this narrow alleyway in the Mughrabi neighborhood of East Jerusalem. Jews were not allowed to have benches. They were not allowed to have mechitzot for davening, not allowed to have in our own Kodesh, all that sort of thing. Every now and then, people would bring them in, and sort of the British would dismantle them. One time, a scuffle in the summer of 1929, a scuffle ensued, and young Beitar activists, Jabotinskyites, began to march in protest. And Rav Kook at one point met with them, and he gave an interview to a newspaper saying that he thought this was a nice idea, that he was proud that he was sort of celebrating their exercise of Jewish pride and Jewish rights to the Kotel. The Haredim were totally uninterested in it. Rav Sonnenfeld, the B'yedah Haredit, was the rabbi who was officially in charge of the Kotel, and he was happy to leave the status quo as it was. Because, of course, we don't have control over the Kotel. We're in exile, right? Zionism changes nothing. And he certainly didn't want control of the Kotel to go over to the Zionists. Rav Kook's interview gets played up in the Arab press as, oh, you see, their chief rabbis is plotting to take over the Temple Mount and destroy the mosques and so forth. And so riots break out in the land of Israel in 1929. In late August 1929, at the time, almost the entire Zionist leadership is out of the country at a Zionist Congress. The leading Zionist leaders, or Yishuv leaders in Palestine at the time, are Rav Kook and Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, the Zionist executive, later the second president of the State of Israel. Rav Kook drafts a telegram to be sent on Shabbat, and here it's in his own hand, right? L'chol ha'yahadut, Niram Yair, right? To all the Jews of, the Kol ha'yahadut Eretz Yisraelit b'sakana. All the Jews of the land of Israel are in danger. Help us in any way you can, as speedily as you can. B'Lashem Haishua, and sort of in the Savior, and the salvation will be of God's. Harav Haraya Avisukul, right? He tries to intervene. He intervenes with the British, and he asks them, "Why don't you start shooting the rioters?" And the British don't comply. He throws himself into relief efforts. He doesn't eat for days. He hardly sleeps. He doesn't eat anything. He just drinks cups of tea with some milk to keep himself going. It was getting dark in Palestine. And, after the riots, at the British commissions, he insists that, that people have to realize that the Jews, of course, have rights from time immemorial to the Kotel. But he says that this is not something to be settled by political means. God will figure out what to do here. in the starting, okay, now this is 1929. A few years after this, we get the rise of Hitler. And in 1933, we have the rise of Hitler. And also, please, if we could go Maria to the next slide. We have the murder of Chaim Arlosoroff. Now, if you see here, this is the Zionist leadership and number of Arab leaders. So the gentleman sitting in the front row here with the glasses is Chaim Arlosoroff. Who's sitting to his right is Chaim Weizmann. Right above to the tall gentleman to Arlozorov's left is Yitzchak Ben Zvi, who I mentioned earlier. And standing next to Yitzchak Ben Zvi, the gentleman with the mustache, is Moshe Sharet, who eventually will be the State of Israel's first foreign minister and eventually prime minister of the State of Israel. So Chaim Arlosoroff, you see he's very young here. He was sort of a wunderkind. He was a brilliant young intellectual who was the head of the political section of the Jewish Agency, and in that capacity was, so to speak, the chief negotiator and diplomat for the Zionist movement with Arabs, but also crucially in 1933 with Germany. In those years, right, it was early in the Hitler regime. Nobody knew, right? Once again, like remember I said last week, nobody in pre-World War I Palestine, nobody knew that in a few years the Ottoman Empire wouldn't exist anymore and the Russian Revolution was going to happen. In those years, nobody knew what Hitler was going to be. They just knew he was this really bad, terrible anti-Semite. But maybe you could deal with him. And in particular, maybe you could negotiate with him, and maybe in exchange for money, he would let Jews go to Palestine. He would let Jews leave. The Jabotinskyites were incensed by this. They thought that it was naive, and they thought that it was an offense against Jewish honor. And so, in June 1933, walking with his wife on the beach in Tel Aviv, he's killed. He's shot and killed. Now, in the days before Arlozorov's murder, by the way, much of what I'm saying here, I don't know if he's listening now. He was here on some earlier evenings, but Professor Monty Penkower has done wonderful work, wonderful research, very meticulously reconstructing Rav Kook's involvement in this whole affair. And much of what I say is I'm very indebted. I'm indebted to all kinds of scholars, but just like to mention in particular here. In the months and weeks leading up to this, there had been incredibly incendiary things written about Arlosoroff in the revisionist, in the Jabotinskyite press, right? Ben Gurion was in Europe, and he was physically attacked by Jabotinskyites. People had written in Jabotinskyite newspapers that the Jewish people always knew how to deal with traitors. And so it was not surprising that several revisionist Zionists were arrested on suspicion of murdering Arlosoroff. In particular, a young fellow named Rosenblatt, Avram Stavsky, and a journalist named Abba Achimeir. Abba Achimeir was a self-described fascist. You had Jews who were fascists, you had Jews who supported Mussolini, you had Jews, by the way, an amazing book by an historian, I forget his first name, last name is Heller, called Jabotinsky's Children, is about sort of these conflicts in the interwar revisionist Zionism, where you had many revisionist Zionists who were self-described fascists and were always trying to pull Jabotinsky further and further to the right. And Abba Achimeir was very much one of those. And so they're arrested by the British. And the Yishuv tears itself apart. Right, sort of the left wing is accusing the right wing of killing Arlosoroff. They're saying no, it's not true. At first, Rav Kook keeps his silence. Doesn't want to get drawn into this because this is a man who's devoted his life on trying to lower the flames to try to get people not to fight so much. Could we please end the share screen for you? Because some people I think we've seen enough of this photo. Or mine. Yeah, okay, I'd like to. Okay, here we are. Right, do you see me, anyone, or no? Or we could just go back to.
We see your.
You see my text? Okay.
Yeah.
So let's just go back to you don't have to see me the rest of the time here. So let's just go back to the PowerPoint, please. Can we do that? So I'm stopping sharing, and so it's not here. Right. But eventually, Rav Kook does become convinced that Arlezerov is not the murderer. Other people become convinced earlier. And a key, I mean, Rabbi Yaakov Meir has personal ties to police investigators who themselves, tell him about Arabs who've confessed to the murder. Other left-wing Zionists begin to suspect that actually the right-wing Zionists didn't kill Arlezerov. Eventually, the person who really convinces Rav Kook to throw himself in here is a rabbi named Natan Milikovsky. Rabbi Natan Milikovsky was a very prominent Zionist orator. He comes to Dr. Rav Kook. Natan Milikovsky had a son named Ben Sion Milikovsky, who was a revisionist, who was a journalist, who was with Abba Achimeir that night in Jerusalem. So like Arlezerov was killed in Tel Aviv, Abba Achimeir can't be the one who killed him because he was with him. Natan Ben Sion, the journalist Ben Sion Milikovsky, by the way, as I'm sure many of you will know, later Hebraizes his name to Netanyahu. He's Ben Sion Netanyahu, the father of the current prime minister. So it also shows you how a lot of these animosities between left and right in Israeli politics that are very vicious to the present have very deep roots. Eventually, Rav Kook becomes convinced that indeed these people are not guilty, and he throws himself and all of his public weight into a campaign of exoneration. Abba Achimeir is exonerated by the British, but then he goes on a hunger strike. Rav Kook writes a letter to him trying to convince him to end his hunger strike, and he begins it by saying, he addresses him as Sofer Yakar, dear precious author. Rav Kook had probably never read a word of Abba Achimeir's. He just knew that he was a journalist and he was a Jew and he was in trouble, but the left goes insane. He goes, the chief rabbi has now declared himself an ally of the fascists. And it just goes from bad to worse. But eventually Stavsky himself is acquitted. They're all acquitted. Stavsky eventually is a member of he's on board the Altalena. In 1948, he's killed in the fight between Irgun fighters and Haganah fighters off the shores of Tel Aviv, years later. So Stavsky is acquitted. They're all acquitted. Rav Kook is vindicated. Rav Kook was also, we showed that Rav Kook had been able to mount a huge public relations campaign in order to defend them. But in his greatest moment of triumph, he's also alone, because the left from here on sees him as a Jabotinskyite. And no matter how much he tries to convince him that he isn't, because Rav Kook didn't have many ties to Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky's first of all, Rav Kook never belonged to any political party. He never formally joined the Zionist movement. The only political party that he expressed support for was not the Mizrahi, but Hapoel HaMizrahi, which is sort of like the left workers version, the left workers religious party, which eventually in the 1950s merged with the Mizrahi to create the Mafdal, the National Religious Party. Rav Kook was not a party man. And he tried very much to hold himself above parties, right? And he certainly, to the extent to which he kindled more to people from the left, because what was the Jabotinsky party? They were these secular nationalist liberals and very capitalist. And all of this stuff was very foreign to his thought world. But he found himself being viewed as their ally, and it poisoned his relations to the left. Through the 1930s, relations between left and right get more and more fierce in Palestine. And if we could go back to if we could move to the next photo in the PowerPoint, please. Right, if we could move after the next one. Move to the next one. Maria? At any rate, Rav Kook is ill with cancer. Right, if we could move to the next slide, please. No, go back, please. Right. And this is the last photo of Rav Kook. He dies in 1935. The last things that he writes, the last things that he publishes in his lifetime are on two subjects. And one of them returns back to his youth. Remember I said in the journal that he started publishing in the 1920s? He writes a lot about Maimonides. 1935 was the octocentennial, the 800th anniversary of Maimonides' birth, and there were all sorts of books, articles, conferences, exhibits, you name it, about Maimonides. And there were articles talking about Maimonides, the philosopher, as opposed to Maimonides, the halachist, the jurist, and the differences between them. And Rav Kook writes these articles saying, no, it's the same person, right? Sort of that philosophy and law and being like a master of, and being like the greatest expositor of the Jewish tradition and a great thinker on the world stage do not contradict one another. And the other last thing that he publishes is a letter, an open letter to the Jews of Palestine to please stop hurting one another, to lay aside. He says, we are all guilty. We're all responsible. All of us, the difficulties and the sorrows that we have, they're all our fault. And let's, dear wounded brothers, he says, let's look to one another as brothers. And in his journals, he writes about his longing to be free of this. He writes about some of his sorrows and some of his sadnesses. And the way he ends his commentary on the Agadah that he began back in Zaimol in the 1890s is in praise of simplicity of the religious life. So Rav Kook dies. And then what happens to his legacy? Well, if we could move forward. So his yeshiva. The chief rabbinate in Rav Kook's years was not a major institution because, I mean, it never really took off in his time because he wasn't a party man. So he was never part of a party, so he could never get budgets, he could never get political support. His successors, Rav Herzog on the one hand and Rav Uziel, the Sephardic chief rabbi, were willing to officially align themselves with the Mizrahi and they get budgets. And also they were better at building systems and organizations, etc., than he was, and they were very significant thinkers in their own right as well. Here's his son, Rav Yehuda Kook. Rav Yehuda does not take over his yeshiva. His successor is head of the yeshiva is Rav Yaakov Moshe Karlat, his disciple. Rav Yehuda, we've met him until now as the editor of his father's writings. Somebody else very involved in the yeshiva, if we could please move forward to the next slide. David Cohen, a Nazir, right? David Cohen David Cohen was an Eastern European yeshiva student who, of course, became a student of philosophy. He too was interned as a Russian national, found refuge in Switzerland, and there he met Rav Kook and became a disciple of his, and became a lifelong Nazir. He was this remarkable philosopher and mystic, and was somebody who also began to teach in Rav Kook's yeshiva, which after Rav Kook's death was renamed the Yeshiva HaMerkazit Olamit. Now, in the first decades after Rav Kook's death, he's not studied very much. Odd though it may sound, the people who were reading him most in those years are philosophers, academic philosophers, especially Hugo Bergman, who also was like the founding librarian of the National Library and the rector of Hebrew University, Natan Rotenstreich and others, Rabbi Dr. Jacob Agus in the United States, because these philosophers reading his book, because the Nazir, okay, I got to say something. The editing of Rav Kook's works. So Yehuda edited Orot, and most of the books called Orot are edited by Orot HaTshuva, Orot Torah, are edited by Yehuda from his father's notebooks, with the exception of Orot HaKodesh, the theological magnum opus that's edited by Rav David Cohen HaNazir. And the editorial styles are different. Simply put, in Orot, Yehuda frames his father as a very nationalist sort of thinker, and the Nazir frames Rav Kook's teachings as a sort of universal philosophy of religion. Now, Rav Yehuda also is alive to the universalist dimensions. The Nazir is also alive to the nationalist dimensions, but it's a question of the larger framing. But the person who really makes Rav Kook a living figure in Israeli society, in many ways, if we could go to the next slide, please, is this figure, Moshe Tzvi-Neria. Moshe Tzvi-Neria migrates from Poland, studies in Merkaz, in studies with Rav Kook in the 1930s, and then afterwards is the founder of, he's one founder, there's this, the Hapoel Mizrahi has this youth movement called Bnei Akiva, right? All the Zionist movements have youth movements. So this is going to be a religious Zionist youth movement. And Rav Neria opens yeshivot, or Bnei Akiva. So in which higher Talmudic study in these yeshiva high schools takes place alongside, in the context, in the frame of a religious Zionist ideology, right? And so he develops several generations of students who are imbued with his understanding of Rav Kook and Rav Kook's Torah and Rav Kook and the role that Rav Kook has placed at their feet that religious Zionism is supposed to be the bridge between religious and secular and bring the Zionist revolution to its full self-consciousness and realization. And if we could go to the next slide. Rav Neria sends students to Yeshivat Merkaz Harav, and here we see students studying with Rav Yehuda Kook. Now, if you take a look, right, you can see like what they have on their heads, the legendary kippot srugot. These are the younger generations of religious Zionists. Now, if we take a look at the next slide, this is Rav Yehuda Kook and the Nazir. So a moment ago, we saw Rav Yehuda and the Nazir as very young men. Here we see them as much older men at the newly liberated Kotel in 1967 with students of theirs who were among the military units who liberated the old city of Jerusalem. Okay? Now, before the war, in the lead up to the 1967 war, a few weeks before the 1967 war is Yom Ha'atzmaut, 1967. It's the 19th anniversary of the State of Israel, and the entire country is terrified, right? Because everybody knows that war is coming. Tzvi Yehuda Kook gives a sikha, gives a talk in his yeshiva. He talks about the significance of Eretz Yisrael. Because remember, Rav Kook dies in 1935. He doesn't see the Holocaust. So Tzvi Yehuda, as his son and his senior successor, has to interpret the Holocaust somehow. How does he interpret it? He takes some ideas of his father's about the historical necessity of exile. And he talks, his father, in his father's book on Shemitah, Shabbat Haaretz, in the introduction, he has a line there where he refers to the destruction of the temples as a cruel surgery that God did in order to get the Jews, because like that biblical Judaism had sort of like played itself out and needed to go into exile, so God performs this cruel surgery. So the Holocaust is a cruel surgery to bring the Jews back. Tzvi is not happy about this. He's not triumphalist about this. He came from Eastern Europe. He lived in Eastern Europe for years, including as an adult. He used to speak Yiddish. He lived in Geula, right, in Chayei neighborhood in Jerusalem. But Eretz Yisrael and the redemption of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael is so important that God was willing even to bring the Holocaust to make this happen. And Tzvi Yehuda talks about how the night of the UN partition vote in 1947, he was heartbroken because how could you divide the land of Israel? How could you cut it in half? And yet, this was God's work. And he said, I tell you now, this state is itself the messianic realization. And then a few weeks later, Israel achieves this stupendous, miraculous victory in the Six-Day War. And it seems that Tzvi Yehuda was a prophet. Now, the first settlements in the territories in Yehuda v'Shomron are not done by religious Zionists. They're done by labor Zionists because they're working out of the traditional ethos of settlement. A great exception there is Gush Etzion, right? Because that had been religious Zionist settlement before 1948, and settlers in Hebron. But when Rav Tzvi Yehuda's message and the youth who are inspired by him really take off, and we can go to the next slide, please, is in the wake of the Yom Kippur War. Here, this is a very, very sobering photo of Israeli soldiers taken prisoner by Syrian troops in 1973. We know what terrible things Israeli POWs were made to endure in Syrian POW. 1973, of course, like 1967, was this great swelling of, was this astounding swelling of Israeli national pride. And of course, 1973 was the apocalypse, right? The country is nearly destroyed. The labor leadership, which had led the country for decades, is entirely discredited. There's this tremendous sense of crisis. Not just, obviously, political and military crisis, but also social, cultural crisis. You read things that are written in Israel in the wake of the 1973 war, and tons of discussions and symposia and novels and books and articles on, like, where did we go wrong? And for the religious Zionist youth, students of Tzvi Yehuda, this is their moment. We can go to the next slide. And they create Gush Emunim, the block of the faithful. this is the moment we are the people who will now be the vanguard of Zionism. If religious Zionism until now is content to be sort of like the cook and bottle washer, or if you will, the kashrut supervisor of Zionism, we will take Jewish national leadership. And here, this is the famous the famous Aliyah Sebastia, the creation of Jewish settlement in Sebastia, which was an abandoned Jordan military camp, and eventually becomes Kidumim. And this is when they are told they're allowed they're allowed more or less to stay. Reb Tzvi Yehuda had come there and had physically placed himself in between soldiers and settlers and saying, "Shoot me," rather than undo this work of settlement. So you see, there's this photo is remarkable. It's Kanan Porat, the Gush Emunim leader, is the one without the beard. Moshe Levinger, the one with the beard, and you see this ecstatic religiosity that this generation of Kippot Srudot now has, because this is how their Reb Tzvi Yehuda has told them that this is what his father would do. Now, with time, so the issue of how you interpret Rav Kook's legacy, right? If Rav Kook is the person who laid out how religious Zionism is supposed to relate to the state and statecraft, what do you do? Because also remember, as I said, Rav Kook is not a political thinker. And he has this idea that Jewish politics can be different, but can Jewish politics be different? The contrary voice to its viewed in religious Zionist camp, if we go to the next slide, please, emerges from Rabbi Yehuda Amital, who himself I mentioned a few moments ago, the yeshiva in Gush Etzion, the Jewish settlements in Gush Etzion. Rabbi Amital is the founder. He's one of the founders of the. He fights in the. He's a Holocaust survivor. Fights in the Haganah. He's one of the founders of the Hesder Yeshiva, who combine military study with army service, and he's the founder of the yeshiva in Alon Shvut in Gush Etzion Yeshivat Har Etzion. Here he is in the very early years of the yeshiva, giving a shiur. Now Rabbi Amital himself is a deep disciple of Rav Kook. He starts reading Rav Kook back in Eastern Europe. He smuggles some of Rav Kook's, an anthology of Rav Kook that Rav Neria had written. He smuggles into the Nazi labor camp in which he's held. And he also has a similarly messianic view of the times. If we go to the next slide. With time, Rav Amital changes. With time, Rav Amital comes to the conclusion that we can't assume that Jewish politics proceeds differently than other politics. He comes to challenge Reb Tzvi Yehuda's view. He thinks that as a Holocaust survivor, he can't accept Reb Tzvi Yehuda's view that the Holocaust was somehow justified, even if what it led to was the creation of the state of Israel. That Reb Kook's as we navigate Reb Kook's vast corpus of teachings, Reb Tzvi Yehuda emphasizes Eretz Yisrael. And he says, no, like the dimension of ethical universalism is the chief category through which Rav Kook, like that ethics are the chief category through which Rav Kook wants to organize the world. Where he really breaks with religious Zionism is at the time of the Lebanon War, because he regards, he speaks out as what he sees false messianism left and right, false messianism of Gush Emunim, the false messianism of peace now. And when he sees the false messianism of Ariel Sharon, each one of them arguing that a simple idea, faith in redemption, faith in good intentions, or faith in military power will solve all of our problems, and actually the world is more complicated than that. And I mean, we're nearly out of time, but after in the last 20 years, of course, Rav Kook's disciples, Rav Kook's legacy and Rav Kook's disciples, if we could go to the next and final slide, please, for you. To this day in Israeli society, people argue, who are you, Rav Kook? What are you? Rav Kook is the man who seems to put everything together. He's the most traditional of thinkers, and he's also the most radical of thinkers. He's the most nationalist of thinkers, and he's the most universalist of thinkers. He's a profound halachist, and indeed, we haven't talked about many of his halachic works, the incredible numbers of rabbinic Sheilot Tshuvot that he answers, the years that he spends writing annotations to the Talmud, and annotations to the Shulchan Aruch. At the same time, he's the most far-reaching mystic. And he's like a profound Kabbalist and a philosopher. And he's a man who celebrates the arts and culture and poetry and sculpture as forms of divine self-expression, while living while advocating for the deepest form of halachic commitment. And at the one time maintaining that one has to be entirely alert to the present, to the life of one's times and involved in it. At the same time, be always thinking beyond. Deeply committed to one's own views and developing a view that can encompass other views. And so Rav Kook is a standing provocation, challenge, enigma, inspiration, who has profoundly shaped Israeli life today. And yet the Israel of today is one that he never saw, and in many ways one that he couldn't have envisioned. I think I'll close for now. I appreciate everyone's patience as I ran over time. I'm glad to spend some time answering some questions, if anyone would care to ask. Or not. So one thing that I will, one thing that I would like to mention is that I have also provided to Tamar and Buria, and thank you once again, Tamar and Buria, for arranging all of this and for working with me on this. I've also put together a document of suggestions for further reading that I'm, happy to share with you all. And if anyone has,
your sources are on the website, and where I could put the link up again. So if anyone wants to check the sources you just mentioned and the further reading are on our website already.
Right. Thank you. And just I'll take one question that someone asked: as a biographer of Rav Kook, would you care to speculate on what Rav Kook would think of his son's political path? Of course, that's the $64,000 question. When I was young, one of the jokes that used to go around was, would Rav Kook have been a supporter of Gush Emunim? And the answer was, of course. He named his son Tzvi Yehuda, didn't he? So obviously, this is one of these questions where where you stand depends on where you sit. Obviously, many people, many good, thoughtful people, argue that Rav Kook's that Rav Tzvi Yehuda was the faithful interpreter of his father's teaching, and that his interpretation of his father's teaching is meant to be authoritative. So if you take a look, Rav Tzvi Yehuda's disciples also have disagreements among themselves. For instance, you have, Rav Tzvi Tau, who is sort of like a leading figure in what's referred to as like the Chardali wing, the Haredi Leumi wing of religious Zionism, where he maintains that the proper understanding of Rav Tzvi Yehuda's teaching, Rav Kook and Rav Tzvi Yehuda's teaching, is that one should maintain a Haredi-like relationship to Western culture, even as one profoundly participates in national revival. Whereas other disciples of Tzvi Yehuda, like say Rav Shlomo Aviner, disagree, right, and sort of are willing to have a less conflictual or segregated relationship with general culture. And then it's a very broad spectrum of views. To me, the question is, what does it mean to follow Rav Kook's views, right? What does it mean and this is just Yehuda Mirsky talking, what sort of responsibility, and especially what sort of moral responsibility do we have to take for our choices, including our choices of how to interpret the sources? It won't come as a great surprise to many people. Just like, I myself am a student of Rav Amital, and Rav Amital himself was also very careful to say that he didn't want students simply to replicate him. I don't want to make a bunch of little Amitals. And I know some of his other students are on this talk this evening, and they can attest to that. But one of the things that he used to say was, Rav Kook was a human being. And human beings don't have to be right about everything. An example he used to give was Rabbi Akiva. Mi kamo Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, perhaps the greatest post-biblical sage who ever lived, mipiv anu chayim, in all sorts of ways. And Rabbi Akiva was wrong about Bar Kokhba, right? That doesn't diminish from one. The question is, must Rav Kook be taken as a kind of oracular figure whose works can brook no contradiction? The same way in Jewish tradition, the Bible is not allowed to contradict itself. And then in the world of rabbinic, of medieval, of Talmudic commentary, right, the Talmud isn't allowed to contradict itself. So then is Rav Kook not allowed to contradict himself? Perhaps he is allowed to contradict himself, or perhaps his Perhaps his ideas somebody like me who thinks like an historian. His ideas move and change and shift over time. The question is, what cluster of ideas and thoughts and perspectives does he give us that we can work with today as we take responsibility in general, and certainly moral responsibility for the choices we make as interpreters of texts, as, my case, the case of many others, people who committed Jews, Israelis, in our lives today. So I hope that's a helpful answer to your question.
Thank you very much, Professor Mirsky.
My pleasure.
We were very happy to host you here for this series. And I think you mentioned that your book should be coming out in Hebrew in Israel in the near future, right?
Oh, yeah, I can. I can mention that. I actually brought along. This is the book that I published about Rav Kook in English. Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution, and it's I think it's in Israel. I think you can buy it in Jerusalem. At least until a while ago, you could buy it in Pomerantz Bookshop, and it's on Depository, Amazon, and that sort of thing. I have another book on him coming out in English, a much thicker, much more academic book called from Academic Studies Press in Boston about Rav Kook's early years. It's called Towards the Mystical Experience of Modernity. And as Tamar mentioned, thank you, in a few months, a Hebrew edition of a revised, not just translated, but a revised Hebrew edition of my book on him under the title Rav Kook Mabat Hadash is scheduled to be published by Kineret Zmora Dvir. So there is that. But as I put out in the suggestions for further reading, there are lots of really wonderful scholars working on Rav Kook. I mean, in that text, that document I sent to Tamar is mainly people in English, but of course there's tons of people working in Hebrew. And there's just tremendous riches to be discovered.
Great, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. And we hope to see you in our future events coming up. Good night.
Thank you very much.